Okay, well, welcome to History of Alaskan Domesticated Ungulates. I'm looking forward to this course, as you should, because the history of domesticated animals in Alaska is a very rich and diverse history. Unfortunately, most of the history is of failure. There has been many attempts to establish livestock here in Alaska, and many have failed. But it's a great story, and that's what I would like to do in this course is tell the story of the few successful attempts and many unsuccessful attempts at starting a domesticated livestock industry in Alaska. But first, let's go over some terms. Some of you may not know what an ungulate is. What is an ungulate? An ungulate is a hoofed animal. You can either have a cloven hoof, a split hoof, an even number of hooves, which we call arteriodactyls. And examples of that are sheep, goats, reindeer, cattle, yaks, bison, and elk. But you can also have ungulates with an odd number of toes or a single toe, and those are perissodactyls. And a good example of that are horses. But in this course, we are just going to emphasize the arteriodactyls. And so, what are livestock? Livestock are domesticated animals that we use for very specific purposes. And those specific purposes, we eat them. They are a source of fiber. Sheep and goats are a very good example of a fiber source, and labor. Not so much in Alaska, but for a lot of people in the circumpolar north, livestock, reindeer, are used as a source of transportation. And many of these livestock, most of these livestock, they are attached to our hip. They cannot survive in the wild or without the stewardship of humans. And so, what do I mean by a domestic animal? Domestication is very different from taming an animal. You can tame an animal, but that is very different from domestication. Domestication, through a process of artificial selection, we have changed an animal morphologically, behaviorally, and genetically to suit the needs of human beings. You can tame an animal, you can tame a wolf or an elephant, but that is not the same as domestication. Domestication is a very specific process. Domestic animals are the result of artificial selection. Artificial selection is very different than natural selection. In natural selection, animals produce many more offspring that survive. There is variation, morphological variation based in genetics, and it's inherited. And there are just not enough resources in the world for all these animals that are born to survive. And so animals that have more fitness or advantages, they're the ones that survive. And that has a genetic basis, and those characteristics are passed on to the offspring. With the process of natural selection, it is good to have a lot of genetic diversity because you are adapting to an environment, and the environment is always changing. And if you have a lot of genetic diversity, if the environment changes, more than likely you'll have one of the characteristics that will allow you to adapt to a changing environment. But that's very different than artificial selection. Through artificial selection, we are selecting for very specific characteristics of an animal. Be it increased milk production or fiber production or just a larger, meatier animal. And so through artificial selection, genetic diversity is decreased. We are selecting for a very select, unique set of genetic characteristics. We here at the university have a research herd of reindeer, and I know all the time people are, and it's a closed herd. We don't bring animals into the herd. All the breeding is done with the herd, and I know people all the time ask me, aren't you worried about inbreeding, or don't you want to bring in increased genetic diversity? No, we don't, because we have a very controlled environment, and we want animals with a certain set of conditions that survive in that particular environment. And why did we ever domesticate animals in the first place? Well, this planet produces a tremendous amount of organic material that we cannot consume. Cellulose is the most common organic molecule on the planet. And we humans, we cannot eat and digest and get anything out of cellulose. And so there's a tremendous amount of energy, potential energy on this planet that we can't use for food. But humans in the past were clever enough to observe that animals, a very specific type of animals, or ruminants, could eat this cellulose and through a very special process utilize the energy in the cellulose to form their tissue. And then we, in turn, were able to consume the animal tissue. So these animals are very special for us, and I would like to think that our quality of life is greatly improved on this planet because of domestic livestock, in particular ruminants. Certainly, there could not be the population of the earth unless we had domestic animals or wild animals as well that can convert this undigestible plant material into something we humans can eat. We don't know, and we don't know when and exactly how humans first started to domesticate animals. It was probably more of a matter of just herding animals around the landscape a while, and animals that weren't so easily herded were probably culled, and so eventually we were selecting for animals that didn't run away from us as much and stayed together as a herd. So once we domesticated animals, like I said, it did improve our quality of life because now we had all this vegetation around us that we could eat, we could consume via animal tissue. We could use animals for companionship, for protection, for religious purposes, and we used them to do a lot of work. Well, in the world, there are a lot of potential animals we could have domesticated. As a matter of fact, there's 148 species of large herbivores in the world that humans could potentially have domesticated, but we domesticated only 14. So why is that? There's such a large array of animals we could have domesticated, but we only domesticated 14. The reason is an animal has to have 6 very specific characteristics to allow it to get through the domestication bottleneck. And if you lack even one of those characteristics, it just doesn't work out. You just will not make a good domestic animal. So what are those 6 characteristics or criteria of an animal that allows it to go through the domestication bottleneck? One is diet. It has to have a diverse and very flexible diet. For example, moose. In Alaska, there is a movement to categorize and classify moose as a domestic animal. But I've known from my personal experience in the past, when I helped feed moose, they have a very specific restrictive diet, and it's very hard to come up with a good diet for moose. They're very hard to feed behind fence. You need an animal that you can gather up a number of foodstuffs and give it, and it survives very well. I like to use reindeer as a very good example of characteristics of a good domestic animal. Reindeer are able to eat a diversity of foodstuffs, so we're not restricted to a very few. Another characteristic of an animal that we need is a reasonably fast growth rate. One, these large mammals, we're raising them to eat. And so we would like them to come up to a size large enough where we can eat. An animal needs to have a reasonably fast growth and maturation rate. We're raising these animals for meat. We need an animal to get up to size where it's worth our while to raise it and slaughter and eat it. We also need it to mature very quickly. So remember, domestication is a process of artificial selection where we select for characteristics we want the animal to have. It doesn't work out very well. Artificial selection doesn't work very well if we wait around for 1 or 2 generations. We need an animal that matures very quickly, has a very short generation cycle. We're able to see a lot of generations and be able to select for these characteristics we want. Another characteristic that a mammal needs to have in order for it to be domesticated is even temperament. It cannot panic in situations around human beings. Deer are a very good example. Deer are now being raised all across the United States. They're behind fence. You can tame them down somewhat, but still they have a tendency to panic and will challenge fences, and which ends up being a problem. They will injure themselves. Another characteristic for an animal we have is the ability to breed in captivity. Some animals, we just cannot get them to breed behind fence. But we need to be able to have them to breed behind fence, so we have very predictable generations that allow us to select for characteristics we want in a domestic animal. Also, an animal needs to have a pleasant disposition. What I mean by pleasant disposition, it does not want to hurt or injure us. Again, I would like to use reindeer as a very good example. You can put thousands of reindeer, which I consider a domestic animal, in a corral, in a enclosed space, and a human being can walk in the midst of hundreds, even thousands of animals, and without fear of being injured by a reindeer. They're just not very aggressive. They're very docile. You can get in fairly tight situations, very tight enclosures with reindeer, and they're not very aggressive to humans at all. You're perfectly safe in a small pen with reindeer, even though they haven't been around humans very much at all. You're very safe. Where you take other animals, for example, bison and elk, which some people consider domestic animals, and I don't. You can put them inside a fence, a closed area, and you walk in amongst these animals, and they are still very dangerous to humans. We can put these animals behind fence generation after generation after generation, and still a human being cannot safely go inside the pen. They are still very aggressive and dangerous to human beings. That characteristic is not very good for a domestic animal. What's another characteristic we need in an animal? It needs to have a defined and modifiable social hierarchy. Animals need to establish themselves within a herd and be able to get along. There's many animals that we can put in an enclosed area, and they do not develop a social hierarchy. They just do not get along very well. Again, I'm going to use reindeer as a good example. We can stick a group of reindeer in a pen that they've never seen each other before, put them in an enclosed environment. Initially, it looks fairly brutal, but they work it out among themselves who the dominant animals are, who the subordinate animals are. Once that social hierarchy is established, the animals get along very well inside an enclosed space. You can take another animal, for example. Again, I'm going to use moose as an a poor example of a domestic animal. You can take a group of moose and put them in an enclosed space, and they do not develop a social hierarchy, a social organizational system. And animals will continuously be very aggressive towards each other, and they do not give in to dominant animals. You do not get a good formation of a social hierarchy. So those are the 6 characteristics an animal has to have in order to be able to go through the domestication bottleneck. If it's missing one of them, doesn't have one of those characteristics, it just won't make it through. And so there are only 14 species of large mammals, herbivores, that have gone through the domestication bottleneck. And the ones here in Alaska we would like to talk about in the course is our cattle, yak, muskox. We will talk about bison and elk, even though according to the definition, they are not domestic animals, and muskox, which we will talk about as well. So we like to think that we humans, that we've domesticated all the animals out there, but that may not be the case for all the domestic animals, in particular dogs. Dogs, they may have domesticated themselves. Quite a long time ago, when we were running around with spears and killing large animals and creating a lot of garbage and waste, there were wolves that probably came to our camps, and we had a lot of garbage. They started to consume the garbage, and it's tough to make a living out there as a wolf, but these wolves that hung around our camps and ate garbage, they were probably better well fed, and their survival rate probably went up. So this characteristic trait of docility, socializing with humans, probably was selected for. And the more docile, the more these wolves socialized to humans, the closer relationship they had with humans, and humans probably actually fed them and protected them, and increased the probability those characteristics would carry on. So maybe the wolves domesticated themselves. Maybe it wasn't us at all. But through the process of domestication, the one trait we always select for is docility, socialize with human beings. But when we select for that particular characteristics, all of a sudden we see these other traits begin to show up. And it doesn't matter what species it is. When we start to select for docility, we start to see animals with increased color variability. Their ears begin to droop, the tails begin to curl up. We begin to see a reduction in brain size, and we see this other process carryover of juvenile traits into adulthood. But all domestic animals have smaller brains than their wild counterparts. Dogs are a good example. Dogs have a much smaller brain than a wolf does. Another characteristic that goes along with the docility is the Paedomorphosis. And that's the retention of juvenile characteristics into adulthood. And these animals have a baby face all the way into adulthood. Dogs have a very large forehead. They have a puppy face. Cows, the original Auroch had a much longer and narrow skull than it does now. Cows now have a much broader head and very much shorter. As a matter of fact, that is one of the characteristics that were used to select for docile animals, is just broadness of the skull. And a lot of reindeer people across the circumpolar north, that is the one physical characteristic that a lot of these people use to select for docile animals is distance between the antler base. They know the farther the distance, the greater likelihood the animal will be tamer and calmer. But we all know one characteristic of domestic animals is their docility, and they don't tend to panic, and they're not very aggressive. We call that impoverishment of the Merkwelt. And so likely some of us believe that this is actually based in some chemistry. Likely what we have done is selected for animals with decreased thyroid function. Because you can see animals with hypothyroidism, and many of these animals have characteristics of domestic animals. They have larger litter sizes, they have color variability, and they carry these juvenile traits into adulthood. So maybe that's all we have done in this domestication process, is select for animals with an underperforming thyroid gland.